Imagine being part of the last generation that memorized phone numbers and the first that memorized Wi-Fi passwords. The last to rewind VHS tapes and the first to swipe on glass screens. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you've lived in two completely different worlds, and that split shaped your brain, your identity, your relationship with risk, with privacy, with connection, and even with yourself. Psychologists struggled for years to decide where to categorize you. Too young to fully belong to Gen X. Too old to be a true millennial. Eventually researchers started calling you Xennials, a microgeneration forged in the narrow window between analog childhood and digital adulthood. And that narrow window may have produced one of the most psychologically adaptable groups alive today. You began life in a world that required patience. If you were bored, you stayed bored. You stared at ceilings. You rode your bike until dark. You knocked on doors and asked if your friends could come out. Plans were fragile because they relied on trust. If someone said, "Meet at 7, you showed up at 7. There was no "Where are you?" text. No location sharing. No backup group chat. Social commitment meant something different. Conversations disappeared into thin air. Embarrassing moments faded into memory instead of being archived. Your childhood existed mostly undocumented. That matters more than we realized at the time. Then, just as you were forming adult identities, the ground shifted. Not gradually, violently. Dial-up tones gave way to broadband. Friendster became MySpace, which became Facebook. Flip phones became smartphones. Suddenly there were endless ways to contact someone. Instead of 3 contact points, home phone, work phone, or showing up, you had email, AIM, text messages, DMs, comments, tags, and notifications. And you adapted. You didn't grow up with it from birth, but you were young enough that it didn't intimidate you. You learned the language of the internet while your brain was still wiring itself. Neuroscience tells us something important here. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, adaptability, impulse control, and learning complex systems, continues developing into your mid-20s. That means many of you were still in a high plasticity phase when the technological revolution exploded. You weren't rigid adults resisting change. You were neurologically primed to absorb it. At the same time, you had enough lived experience to remember life before it. That dual exposure created something rare, cognitive bilingualism. You speak analog and digital fluently. This shows up in subtle ways. You can sit through a face-to-face conversation without compulsively reaching for your phone, because your social instincts were formed before constant digital interruption. But you also don't panic when software updates or when a new platform appears. You don't romanticize technology as salvation, nor do you automatically distrust it. You evaluate it. You compare it. You remember what changed. Your relationship with privacy is fundamentally different from those who grew up documented. In your teenage years, your worst haircut lived only in memory. That awkward breakup survived in stories, not screenshots. There is power in that. Research on autobiographical memory shows that human memory is designed to evolve. We reconstruct the past each time we recall it. We soften edges. We reframe events. We extract meaning. But when everything is recorded and searchable, that natural editing process gets disrupted. You were one of the last groups to experience identity development without permanent digital evidence shadowing you. That likely shaped your resilience and your narrative flexibility. You also learned independence in a way that's harder to manufacture now. Many of you were latchkey kids. You navigated neighborhoods alone. You solved boredom creatively. Your parents didn't track your location by GPS. They trusted you to come home when the streetlights came on. That builds a particular kind of self-reliance. You learned to regulate yourself without constant supervision. You tolerated discomfort. You waited. And waiting builds patience, a trait increasingly rare in an on-demand world. Yet just as you stepped into adulthood, just as careers were beginning, the 2008 financial crisis hit. Timing matters in psychology. Entering the workforce during economic collapse leaves a mark. Research on financial trauma suggests that instability during early adulthood can permanently alter risk tolerance and security behavior. Many Xennials experienced layoffs, underemployment, delayed homeownership, or stagnant wages during years that were supposed to establish stability. That creates a paradox. You are adaptable because you had to be, but beneath that adaptability can live a quiet anxiety. What if it collapses again? This combination is psychologically fascinating. You carry Gen X skepticism because you remember a world that functioned without digital saturation. You carry millennial optimism because you witness technology expand possibility. You trust yourself because you had to. But you also question institutions because you watched them fail at a critical moment. You don't fully belong to either camp, and that in-between feeling may actually be your strength. Being between forces perspective. You remember the before and the after. You remember life when being unreachable was normal. Hours could pass without anyone knowing where you were, and it didn't mean something was wrong. That experience created a different nervous system baseline. Constant connectivity wasn't your default setting. You learned it later. So you can step away, at least more easily than those who never knew another reality. You understand presence because you lived it. At the same time, you appreciate modern convenience. GPS means you don't carry printed MapQuest directions. Streaming means you don't fear missing your favorite show forever. Online banking, remote work, global communication, these are gains you recognize clearly because you remember their absence. That balanced perspective tempers nostalgia. You're not blindly longing for the past, but you're also not naive about the cost of progress. What defines you psychologically may be your comfort with contradiction. Independent but collaborative. Skeptical yet open. Self-reliant but digitally fluent. Many people struggle to hold opposing truths without tension. You practice it daily. You understand that technology connects and isolates. That freedom requires responsibility. That stability can vanish. That change is inevitable. Having lived through one massive transition, you internalized adaptability as a survival skill rather than a buzzword. There's also an identity nuance here. During adolescence, identity forms through experimentation and feedback. For younger generations, that feedback loop is amplified and permanent. For older generations, it was mostly local and temporary. You experienced both models across your developmental arc. Early experimentation was private and fleeting. Later experimentation was visible and archived. That shift likely sharpened your awareness of self-presentation. You understand the difference between who you are offline and who you appear to be online because you remember when those worlds weren't merged. Culturally, generational conversations often flatten nuance. Gen X versus millennials becomes a shorthand. But microgenerations like yours reveal how arbitrary those boundaries can be. A few years, especially during periods of rapid technological and economic change, can produce drastically different lived realities. Your experience illustrates that history doesn't move evenly. It lurches. And those caught at pivot points carry distinct psychological imprints. Consider your tolerance for ambiguity. You witnessed authority structures shift. Media transformed. News cycles accelerated. Trust in institutions fluctuated. You learned early that stability is conditional. That awareness can produce anxiety, but it can also produce flexibility. When the world shifts again, as it inevitably will, you have evidence that you can adjust. You've done it before. There's a subtle resilience in remembering slowness. In a world optimized for speed, you know what slower felt like. That memory can function as an anchor. You understand that not every silence requires filling, not every notification requires immediate response. You learned conversation before constant interruption. That skill, deep attention, has become a competitive advantage. At the same time, your economic scars may influence decision-making. You might prioritize savings, diversify income streams, hesitate before large risks. Financial caution isn't always fear, it can be wisdom earned through timing. Psychologists note that early adult instability can recalibrate long-term expectations about security. You may work harder not just for ambition but for protection. Socially, you navigate intergenerational spaces with unusual fluency. You can relate to older colleagues who prefer direct conversation and younger ones who thrive online. You understand both rhythms. That makes you translators in workplaces and families. And translators often become bridges, quiet stabilizers during cultural shifts. Perhaps the defining feature of your experience isn't superiority or hardship. It's transitional literacy. You learned that environments evolve. The world you're raised in may not resemble the world you inherit. That lesson is invaluable now, when technological acceleration shows no signs of slowing. Artificial intelligence, remote ecosystems, digital identity, these are new shifts, but adaptation is not new to you. If you sometimes feel like you don't fully belong anywhere, that discomfort may reflect your liminal position. You are young enough to remember floppy disks and old enough to remember life without the internet entirely. You sit between eras. But being between eras means you see both edges. And perspective is power. In a time when many feel overwhelmed by rapid change, your lived history offers a template: adapt without erasing yourself. Embrace innovation without forgetting what grounded you. Recognize loss without rejecting progress. That balance is rare. You are not defined by nostalgia or by trend. You are defined by transition. By the ability to hold memory and momentum simultaneously. By understanding that identity is flexible, that technology is a tool, that stability is fragile, and that adaptation is a skill that strengthens with use. The world will continue to transform. It always has. But if you were born in that narrow window between 1976 and 1985, you carry something unique, proof that you can move through seismic shifts and remain intact. You've already navigated analog to digital, scarcity to overload, stability to collapse and back again. That history lives in your nervous system. And maybe that's the real story of Xennials, not that you don't fit into a neat generational box, but that you were trained, quietly and unintentionally, for a future defined by change. You learned how to evolve without losing your center. In an era that demands constant reinvention, that may be one of the most valuable psychological advantages of all. If this resonates, it's not coincidence.